time frame that could fit into an hour. So I want to thank our group of consultants who partnered with us. So as we begin this training, I want you to start thinking in terms of standard home safety practices that you all already exhibit where you live. So for instance, most every home, or we advise folks to install smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. If we have a pool and we invite little people to our house, we keep our eye on them. We have a gate around the pool or our property to keep people from accidentally falling in and drowning. We encourage people to store medications safely so that our little people can't get access to them, or if we have teenagers or visitors coming to our house, that they can't gain access to our controlled medications. We secure our TVs and our stoves and the dressers. We secure them to the wall so that we prevent them from tipping over. We keep a fire extinguisher, hopefully, in our homes in case we're cooking bacon and the house catches, the pan catches on fire. When we leave our kiddos with a babysitter, we have emergency phone numbers. So we want to start thinking about this access to lethal means in our homes, specifically firearms. We want that to be the same frame of reference that you have in mind as we talk about reducing the easy access to firearms in your home. So why should we talk about suicide? Well, in Missouri, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death across all age groups. But for our young people in our homes, ages 10 to up to 34, suicide's the second leading cause of death, second only to accidents. And our suicide death rates in Missouri and in the United States has increased by over 30% over the last 2 decades. 82% of young people will use a firearm that they have access to in either their own home or perhaps in a relative's home. Maybe it's a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle. Talking about suicide is a research-informed version of prevention. It's a strategy. When I was a young person growing up, a young adult growing up, there was a lot of shame and stigma. And we talked about suicide in whispers, and we thought that if we talked about it, we could cause it to happen. What we know from years of research and understanding suicide better is that if we talk about suicide, if we ask about it, if we engage people in those really personal, caring conversations, when we see that they're despondent, that they're having struggles, that we can actually prevent them from attempting suicide and we can get them to help. Everyone has a role in preventing deaths of despair. You don't have to have a license to do counseling. You don't have to be a doctor. Just like any of you can and probably have learned how to do CPR, you can learn how to have this conversation on access to lethal means. And bottom line is, we believe that suicide is generally preventable. Now, we are not under the illusion that all suicides are preventable, but we believe that most can be prevented if we know how to recognize the signs, if we're willing to ask the question, and then if we can take it one step further and we can talk about access to lethal means. So what leads to concerns about suicide? What might be some flags that you might recognize in someone who might be at risk or thinking about suicide? They may appear as being depressed. They may be going through a major life change, such as breaking up or going through a divorce, or maybe they're experiencing a legal setback. Maybe they're consuming or using drugs or alcohol much more frequently or a larger quantity. They've started to withdraw from activities that they used to show up for and used to enjoy. Maybe they're talking about or dropping hints that they would be better off dead, or their family would be better off without them, or that they're a burden. Maybe they're expressing that they've lost hope for the future, that they don't think that things are going to get better and there's no help for them. Maybe they're engaging in behaviors that demonstrate more recklessness that could cause injury or bring about death. Maybe they're talking about feeling trapped in their situation and they can't identify ways to remove themselves from the situation or to solve the problems that they're experiencing. And then also another concern is their easy access to lethal means, especially firearms. Let's just reframe this a little bit. So what we're looking for is changes in what would be typical behavior, what you would expect to see in your loved one. So is there a change in their mood? Are they experiencing or going through a major life change? Is there substance use? Maybe it's new or it's an increased substance use. You're noticing a difference in their behaviors, how they're engaging with you or their family or with their colleagues and friends. And then you're also recognizing there's a change in their affect. There's a change in the way they present emotionally. So if you were in the previous session, as I mentioned, Conversations on Access to Lethal Means is based on that clinical model of calm that was developed at a higher level with much more technical terms for people who are in the medical field or behavioral health professionals that they could use in that clinical setting. It is a featured resource distributed by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. Now, I want to give a caveat that calm is just one part of suicide prevention. I wish it were the whole kit and caboodle, but it's an important piece to that greater comprehensive puzzle when it comes to preventing suicide. If you hear nothing else from me today, this training is not anti-guns and we're not even anti-drugs. What we are is anti-suicide. We want to help keep people who have access to guns and even other lethal methods in their home. We want to keep them safer so that they don't die if they should be facing a period of life where they're feeling despair and despondency. So does this work? Does reducing access to lethal means work? And the answer is yes, but it requires effort. It requires policy changes. It requires people getting involved and intervening. And so we have several examples around the globe of how reducing access to lethal means work to reduce suicide in other countries. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, one of their major economic methods for their country is in agriculture. And they previously had, in agriculture, of course, you understand that they use pesticides to keep their crops healthy and from being eaten up by invading species and things like that. But what they knew from understanding the phenomena of suicide in Sri Lanka was that the leading method for suicide was the pesticides. They were stored openly out in the fields. They weren't secured. The chemical formula for the pesticides was extremely toxic. And so having these easy access, they watched their suicide rates increase over a period of 5 decades. But then in the late 1990s, they placed some restrictions. They did some reformulating to help with climate change and with what's best for the earth. And they reformulated those pesticides. They also changed the way that they stored the pesticides and they started locking them up. They weren't open access and available to anyone who walked into the fields. When they did that, they saw that their suicide rate by pesticide poisoning dropped by 50%. Non-fatal poisonings by other methods didn't budge. It moved simply because they removed access to and changed the lethality of an extremely lethal method. Another example coming from here in the United States was when we had changes to our automobiles. In literature or in media or in movies, you might have seen previously people dying by carbon monoxide poisoning. They would pull their car into the garage, close the garage door, turn their car on, and they would asphyxiate from the carbon monoxide. Well, with the invention of the catalytic converter in 1975 to reduce the emissions for EPA standards and to improve our overall air quality, that method for dying by suicide became much less lethal. And we saw that our suicide rates across the United States significantly reduced simply because of the inclusion of the catalytic converter on cars for completely other reasons. It wasn't a suicide prevention strategy. Other lethal methods didn't decline. It was simply driven by this method of suicide. And then another example comes out of the country of Israel. So in Israel, young people between the ages of 20, they have compulsory participation in the Israeli Defense Force. And so these young people, they come together, they go to Army training, they're issued firearms. And what they were seeing was that on the weekends or for long holiday time periods, these young people would go home or they'd go back to visit a community, and they were allowed to take their firearms with them. Many young people away from the structure of the Army, from people checking in on them, having access to their support system, were dying by suicide, and they were using their Army-issued firearm to bring about their death. They instituted a policy change in the early 2000s where when their military members went home, their firearms had to remain at base. Their suicide death rates by firearm decreased simply because of that policy change. And that is the basis for our belief and the reasonings why we believe having conversations about access to lethal means with firearm owners can save lives, and why we all can save a life. So I want to share you just a quick video from our friends at the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition that kind of demonstrates this idea a little bit. We also understand that suicide is not a constant. It ebbs and flows, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And this video hopefully will demonstrate this for us.
Last year I was at my lowest, going through some pretty serious depression. A couple of friends of mine stopped by the house and said they were worried about me. Said they'd feel a lot better if they could hold on to my firearms until things turned around. I think they saved my life.
If your loved ones are struggling, talk to them about temporarily storing their guns away from their home, because things do get better.
Okay, so again, suicide isn't permanent. It's something that can ebb and flow. And if we can get folks to help, they don't have to be continue to be suicidal. Just give me 1 second. I'm trying to pull up my slides here. There we go. So they aren't continuously suicidal. And if we can put some time and distance between that person and their firearm until things get better, then we can prevent death. And then when things do get better, they can have their firearm back and go back to enjoying their firearm activities. So calm is helpful because there's 4 key ingredients to our understanding about the occurrence of suicide. And that one is ambivalence. Most people who are thinking about suicide or even engage in suicidal behaviors, they're ambivalent about living and dying. And oftentimes they might even say, I don't want to die. I want to get out of this situation. I want something to happen to change my circumstances. And they see that suicide is the only way out. The thoughts and feelings about suicide are transient and temporary. They come and go. And that urgency also ebbs and flows. They can have a strong, urgent sense of or feeling of despair for a period of time. And then they get distracted or they engage in some other activity, or someone comes along and involves them in conversation. And that thought process, that urge for suicide dissipates. And then as well, lethality. The different methods, the lethality of the various methods differ. Not all of them are as lethal as a firearm. So let's talk about this a little bit. This is a picture of a young man named Kevin Berthia. He is the young man standing here on the wrong side of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I hope not to slaughter Kevin's story, but on this day, in despair and despondency, Kevin had decided he was going to end his life by jumping off of the Golden Gate Bridge. Kevin Briggs is the California Highway Patrol officer you see there talking to him, recognized that Kevin was in despair, needed some help. And Kevin stood there on the bridge for, I think it was about 45 minutes, just having a conversation. Mostly Kevin Briggs sat there and listened to Kevin Berthia talk about his pain, talk about his reasons for dying, talk about his reasons for living. And over that course of that conversation, Kevin Briggs was able to convince Kevin Berthia to come back over and to help Kevin understand that while he was feeling suicidal, there is help available. People do care. And he was able to help get him to resources of support. And now Kevin and Kevin are actually national speakers. They go all around the country sharing their story from their various perspectives as suicide prevention advocates. Talking about that transiency or temporary nature of suicide, most people who attempt suicide do not go on to die by suicide. So in the chat box, go ahead and enter your guess at what do you think of those who attempt a nearly lethal suicide or make a nearly lethal suicide attempt. How many eventually go on to die by suicide, do you suppose? Is it 75% go on to die by suicide, 45%, 25%, or 10%? Don't be bashful. There's no right and there's no wrong. Well, there is a right, but if you don't know the right answer, it's totally okay. No one's gonna shame you here. So there's a variety of guesses and assumptions, and some of you have gone to a training before and already know and understand that of those who survive an even nearly lethal suicide attempt, only 10% go on to die by suicide. So there's a statistic out there. I can't remember if it's like 1.3 or 1.8, but it's under 2 million people a year make some kind of a suicide attempt in the United States each year. That could be from not very lethal, but they thought it would bring about death, to the most lethal method of a suicide attempt. Only 10% of those will actually go on to die by suicide in the course of their lifetime. Most people survive, or if they survive their suicide attempt, they're going to go on to die by some other method. All right, so urgency. Among survivors of suicide, of near fatal suicides, when they were asked about the length of time from their decision to complete suicide and engage in those suicidal behaviors, 47% said that it was less than 1 hour. That less than an hour went by from the time they made their decision to they started engaging in those behaviors. And 24% said it was less than 5 minutes. And if you live in a home where there are firearms or a firearm that isn't stored, unloaded, and locked up, and you have a person who lives with you, maybe it's a young person, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's your partner who is struggling with thoughts of suicide, and they know that you have a firearm stored in your bed nightstand that's locked and loaded and ready to go, but you're at work, it's nearly impossible to get home within 5 minutes to take that firearm away from that person. As well, once a firearm is fired, once it's discharged, it's nearly impossible to survive from that suicide attempt. So putting any kind of time or distance between a person at risk for suicide and lethal means can save a life. So here's another question for you guys. What do you think is the leading lethal means for suicide here in Missouri? Is it poisoning? Is it suffocation? Or is it firearms? Or asked another way, what do people use here in Missouri to die? What are they most likely to use when they die by suicide? I see a couple firearms coming in on the chat box. The answer is firearms. Here in Missouri, almost 60%, 6 out of 10 people who die by suicide here in Missouri are going to use a firearm to bring about their death. Suffocation is the second leading method by which people will die here in Missouri. That's the second likely method that they will die by suicide, followed by poisoning. So that's overdosing or ingesting like a legal toxin or a lethal toxin, or poisoning by carbon monoxide or some other type of poisoning mechanism. So the different methods, the lethality varies greatly. Depending on which study you look at, upwards of 90%, 80 to 90% of folks who attempt suicide with a firearm are going to go on to die in that suicide attempt. Versus if someone were to attempt suicide by overdose or by self-injury, such as stabbing themselves or cutting themselves, only 1 to 2% who attempt suicide by those methods are going to go on to die. 98% are going to survive that suicide attempt. So if we reduce access to these 80, for these 80 to 90% people, we can increase the number of who are surviving a suicide attempt. So why are we focusing on firearms? And you might as well guess, it's because it's the leading method in the United States and Missouri. In the US, over 50% of suicide deaths are completed with a firearm. It's almost always fatal. That decision time, anywhere from less than 5 minutes to less than an hour, just increases that risk. 27% of Missouri residents own a firearm, but 46% of homes have a firearm in it. So half of the homes in Missouri are at increased risk for suicide simply by having a firearm placed there. They aren't more likely to have mental health or to have risk factors for suicide. It's just by having access to a firearm. Also, it's culturally acceptable in Missouri to open carry, to have easy access to our firearms. We live in rural Missouri. We have lots of farmers. We have some ranchers. We live a long distance from law enforcement to help us keep our cattle, our property, ourselves, our family members safe. And so it's very culturally acceptable to have easy access to firearms. So we want to talk about this, the availability of this, of the firearm as being, a suicide risk factor. Well, we know that in states that have much more restrictive laws and policies for gun ownership, whether it's needing to take a firearm safety course or they have waiting periods after passing the background check to purchase a firearm. We know that suicide rates vary from those states with increased laws and policies and increased rates for those states like Missouri that are much more relaxed in our gun ownership rules and policies. And mentioning again, 82% of youth who die by suicide use a firearm that's owned by a family member. And in Missouri, it's culturally acceptable for our young people to have or to own their own firearms. That they get a 22 for a special birthday when they're 12 years old or when they're a teenager, or maybe they go hunting with dad. And so their dad has taught them how to safely handle a firearm, and they know where dad keeps everything and they know how to handle the firearm. And then as well, parents often underestimate the likelihood that children can obtain their firearms. Unfortunately, parents too often tell us, parents who have young people who die by suicide often tell us, we taught him firearm safety. He knew how to handle a gun. She had hunter safety education. But what we know from research is that knowledge of how to properly handle the firearm, how to load it, what the firearm accomplishes can actually increase risk if it's not stored safely. Because we're not talking about someone who is problem solving and thinking through with a fully healthy brain. We're talking about someone who is thinking with a brain that's very myopic, very focused in on, I want to end my emotional pain, my physical pain. I want to get out of where I feel trapped. So you might be asking yourself, well, maybe it's not the guns that are a problem. So I'm going to pose to you, are people who live in homes with guns more likely to have a suicide or more likely to have a mental health problem? Nope, they're not. They're not any more likely than non-gun owners to have a mental health problem. Are people who live in homes with guns more likely to seriously consider suicide than people who live in homes without guns? Nope, they're not. Are they more likely to attempt suicide? Again, no. They're not any more likely to think about suicide, to have a mental health condition, or even attempt suicide. They're just more likely to die if they make a suicide attempt and have easy access to firearms. So who can benefit from having a conversation about access to lethal means? Do you think it's anyone expressing suicidal thoughts, someone who has only a vague suicide plan, only someone with a specific suicide plan, or anyone who's struggling with depression or substance misuse with additional potential stressors? So go ahead, type in the chat box. Which do you think is the right answer? Is it A, B, C, or D? I see an all of the above, I see a D, I see a C, some all of the aboves. This is actually a trick question. It's all of the above. Anyone that you recognize who's thinking about suicide, might be at risk for suicide, or coming up with a plan for suicide, is talking about suicide. I would even argue anyone who has a firearm in their home can benefit from, hey, let's have this conversation about how we're going to safely store our firearms to prevent accidental injury or death. So why, when, and where would you use or engage in having a conversation on access to lethal means? Anytime you see the warning signs or you have that gut feeling that, oh, I think Katie is talking about suicide. I'm really worried about Katie. Those warning signs that I learned about in that training that one day, I recognize she's talking about feeling trapped, that she's withdrawn, she's not showing up for baseball practice, that she's not attending church as much. And I heard that, she's been drinking a lot lately, and that she and her husband have split up. And none of those are happening for me, by the way. But you might recognize these signs. You might recognize these changes in your friend, Katie. And so whenever you see these warning signs, those are invitations. And that's why you would engage in a conversation on access to lethal means. So when would you want to have this conversation? As soon as possible. Don't wait until you can invite Katie to go out for lunch on Saturday afternoon. Engage in that conversation as soon as you can. Stress that you're concerned for her safety. If we delay having this conversation and it's Wednesday and you're like, oh, gosh, when can I get to Katie to have that conversation? I'll invite her Saturday. What can happen between today and Saturday? And we might be too late. And then where do we have this conversation about access to lethal means? Well, wherever it's convenient, preferably someplace that is familiar and comfortable for both you and Katie, and a place that's safe. And a safe environment. A safe environment can include an environment that's relaxing and comforting, or that can provide some type of privacy, because it can be an emotional conversation. So how do we start this conversation? How do I engage Katie when I'm recognizing that she's having thoughts or maybe at risk for suicide? Start off by just expressing your concern. Presumably you have a relationship, some type of rapport with Katie, and just reflect back to her, Katie, I'm concerned for your safety. I'm worried about you. I know you're going through a hard time because you and your spouse are splitting up. And I've noticed you've not been showing up for baseball practice and haven't been attending church. And I'm just kind of concerned about all of the things that I'm seeing. And you can even say, I went through a training and I learned that at times when people are going through the hard time you say you're experiencing, I hear you say you're going through, I'm wondering if you've ever thought about suicide, or I'm wondering if you've ever had thoughts about killing yourself. It can be as direct as that. Preferably it's as direct as that, just sharing your concern and your care and compassion for her and that you're worried about her safety. So I want to engage you and invite all of you in your locations where you are now to have the opportunity to practice asking about suicide. So we don't have to unmute ourselves. You're just going to do it in the space where you are. Maybe you've never said these words, never thought you would say these words. In this safe environment, I want you to feel what it feels like in your throat, in your chest, in your heart, to ask someone, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking of killing yourself? So go ahead. I'm going to count to 10 silently in my space and wait for you all to ask these two questions. All right. So moving on the conversation with Katie, you've told her, you're concerned for her safety. You recognize the struggles that she's experiencing in life. You've asked her, I'm wondering if you've ever had thoughts about killing yourself. And Katie says, no. Okay, great. I'm so glad to hear that. Because it's not uncommon to have those thoughts cross our minds when we're really, really struggling. I went through this training that talked about, lethal means, and I just wanted to visit with you a little bit about what you're doing to keep yourself safe at home. And then offer yourself up as a resource for support. Maybe you don't know Katie well enough. And so you can ask, Katie, do you happen to be a gun owner, or do you have a gun in your home? And that might feel a little intrusive or uncomfortable. And Katie might take a step back, like, why are you asking? You could say, well, I'm really glad to hear that you're not having thoughts about suicide, and thanks for trusting me with this conversation. Knowing that you have a gun at home, and when people are feeling despair or despondency, when they're going through struggles like you're going through, and I know you've got a gun at home, it can increase the chances that you might attempt suicide, and having access to that easy access to a gun in the home might bring about injury or death. And then you could take the conversation into the next step. But if Katie says yes, going back to asking the question about suicide, if Katie says, yes, I have had those thoughts have crossed my mind, say, thank you for trusting me with that. And I can't imagine how stuck you must feel, or I can't imagine what's going on with you. What can I do to help you? How can I best support you? And then follow up with, I really want to help you keep safe during this time. And, I know about some resources, because I got access to some resources when I went to the CALM training today. But I'm wondering if you've ever thought about how you would kill yourself, or what method you would use. And Katie might share, well, I was thinking I might go buy a gun. I don't own one, but I was kind of thinking of buying a gun because I know it's really lethal, or that's how someone in my family died by suicide. And then you can follow up by asking, Katie, what can we do to keep you safer? Kate, or maybe Katie volunteers, my brother-in-law has a gun and I would go over to his house. Or Katie might volunteer, my husband has guns. We have lots of guns on our property, at our house, and I would just use a firearm. You can engage Katie, and what can we do to keep you a little bit safer, to keep things safer in your home so that you don't have such easy access to those guns. When you're having that conversation with Katie, some questions you can follow up for some more information is, Katie, how long would it take for you to access the gun? Well, in that first scenario where she'd go buy one, well, I'd have to go buy one. Okay. It might take considerable time to go across town, time to pass the federal background check, and that might create some interruption versus if it's at her brother-in-law's house. Well, I was thinking, I know when my brother-in-law and sister work and I have a key to their house. Again, there might be an opportunity for someone to interrupt or disrupt the behavior. But if they're in her house, and she has very easy access to them because they're not locked. She knows the combination to the safe, or she knows where her husband keeps the keys to the gun safe. She might have much easier, much quicker access. This helps us to establish a potential timeline and to help us determine the immediacy of risk for Katie. So what changes could we do to reduce your access to them? Help Katie to shift towards thinking about safety. We're not trying to take her gun ownership rights away from her. We're trying to increase her safety. Maybe we shift her towards thinking about considering if she has access to ammunition. Does she have any ammunition in the house? If she doesn't, again, that puts a little bit more time and space between making that firearm dischargeable. Maybe if we can store the firearms and ammunition separate, making sure the firearm is stored unloaded and locked. Who else can we identify that could help us put some time and space between Katie and the firearms that she has access to? We want to keep that conversation going by working together to find a plan that will keep Katie safe for now, that makes the most sense for Katie, that's the most agreeable to Katie. Maybe Katie is like, they're not my guns, they're my husband's, I'm not supposed to touch them. So maybe we need to get Katie's spouse involved in this conversation and working with others. And then we don't want to leave Katie alone until we can pass her off to someone that we can trust that they're going to be safe with. So let's watch a video of what this conversation about reducing Katie's access to firearms might look like. Sorry, I'm not sure if I shared that right with my sound. Oh, yep, okay.
The majority of gun deaths in the U.S. are suicides, not criminal violence. As people who care about guns and gun rights, we can help bring those numbers down. How can lawful and responsible gun owners help? How can we make a difference?
Well, that was fun, yeah? Did you like the 686?
Oh, I loved it.
Cool.
When's the last time you spoke to your brother?
Yesterday, we were talking about planning Mom and Dad's anniversary party.
How did he sound?
Okay, a little down, but it's hard to tell.
Let's see if we can take him out to supper. Get him out of the house.
Yeah.
I'm really worried about him.
Hey, Bob. Mary. You guys didn't have to stop by. Come on in.
How are you holding up?
She came by today when I was out to pick up some things.
and she took Samson. Can you believe it? My dog? She took my dog.
Are you kidding me? You had Samson before you even met.
I know.
We were just about to go get a bite to eat. Why don't you join us? It would be good to get you out of here.
Yeah, let's get you out of the house for a while, man.
No, I just want to stay here, okay? Look, guys, I appreciate you coming, but I'm fine, really. You know, just go to dinner. I'm all set. I'm fine.
We have some time before we go, so maybe we just stay a while. Give you a chance to change your mind.
Recognizing someone may be at risk is the first step towards helping to prevent a potential tragedy. Putting time and distance between a suicidal person and a firearm just might save a life.
Hey, Stuart, so we were thinking of getting Mary in 1911 in 9mm, and she really liked your Colt when we went shooting last summer. Do you think we can borrow your Colt? Just for about a week, you know, just so we can take it out to the range and see if it's what she likes. You still have it, right?
Yeah, I do.
Listen. We're worried about you. Do it for our sake. At least until the worst of this blows over.
Suicide deaths are terrible for everyone involved. Firearm suicides also hurt the cause of liberty when the numbers are used to justify more gun laws. Let's work together to reduce all suicides, especially the ones where a firearm may be used. Sometimes getting involved at a critical point during someone's despair may make the difference. You may think that a suicidal person without a gun will just find another way to die, but virtually anything they might substitute is less likely to kill them because guns are so quick and so effective. Other people may delay their attempt because suicidal feelings often come and go. The more time and distance you can put between a suicidal person and a gun, the better their odds of making it through alive.
All right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right back into my slides because I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. So the best, safest option is if you can get that person to agree to remove firearms from the home. But we want to make sure that the person who holds on to the firearms for them is legally able to, and that they can safely store those firearms so that they aren't at risk or people in their homes aren't at risk for a firearm. Another option that you could get them to think about as an alternative is maybe storing firearms at a storage facility. Now, there would be a fee involved, but sometimes off-site storage facilities offer lockers or weather-controlled closets where they allow firearms to be stored. Some gun stores, shooting ranges, offer gun lockers where you can lock up a firearm at their property, because sometimes when people engage in shooting sports for recreational activities, they just leave their gun there at the shooting range and they don't even bother to bring it home. So again, there's a fee involved, but it might be nominal for a short period of time. Another option that might be creative is to go to a pawn shop and take out a small nominal loan against the firearm or firearms. If they have an FFL, they're obligated to lock up those firearms in their gun vault. Then once the risk, that time period passes and the situation has improved, then those firearms can be returned as long as the person pays back the surcharge fee and the nominal loan and can pass the federal firearms background check. It's not an ideal, it may not be the best process, but it's creatively problem solving to get to a place where that person is safer and we've increased time and distance. Some law enforcement agencies, depending on where you're located, they might be willing to hold on to firearms in the circumstance of someone's a threat to themselves or others. You really need to check with what your local law enforcement agency's policies and practices are, but that might be an option. So I know a lot of gun enthusiasts who are like, I don't want my guns leaving in my house, or I have too many to remove them from my house. So what can we do to layer safety for those firearms while they remain in the house? Lock them in a gun safe or a gun lock. Even buying a $60 gun safe for a pistol that has a key, and the person who is at risk for suicide doesn't have access to that key. It's kept on a trusted someone at all times. If you have a gun safe, make sure that the person who's at risk for suicide doesn't know what the combination is, doesn't have access to the keys. You can also do some distraction techniques, like stick that magnet to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline onto the gun lock or gun box or gun safe. Maybe keep a picture of a friend, of a loved one, or something that people care about in that gun safe. I have a colleague who's a gun owner and is a suicide attempt survivor. He keeps a picture of his grandchildren in his gun safe, so that if ever in a moment of despair or despondency he goes to grab for a gun, he's going to see his beautiful babies and hopefully he's hoping that would create a deterrence for him to stop and step away and get help. Newly purchased firearms are all required to come with a cable lock, but if it's a firearm that has been transferred from one person to another person, or sold or handed down over generations, maybe you need to acquire or purchase a cable lock or a trigger lock, or even a clamshell from a gun store. Many law enforcement agencies, if not most all law enforcement agencies, participate in Project Child Safe. You can go get a cable lock for free. Those are not 100% foolproof, but it would increase the time between making the decision to attempt suicide with a firearm and their time that they could fire that firearm. Maybe it's removing a key component. Maybe it is removing the firing pin, or removing the barrel or the chain, or making sure that the firearm doesn't have ammunition in the chamber, or locking the clips up, the magazines somewhere else, separate from the actual handgun itself. Now, when a firearm is present or used for personal safety, or because of someone's career, maybe they're in law enforcement, maybe if it's for personal safety, then in the immediate time period, the greater risk is with that person having easy access to firearm. So can we do something else to increase your personal safety? Install a home safety device, buy mace, put a baseball bat next to the bed, use a security system. If self-defense is essential, urge that person to use something else other than a gun. Or if need be, go buy a biometric safe, so that gun safe can only be opened with the fingerprints of a person who's not at risk for suicide, a safe and trusted, responsible person. Or make sure that firearm is holstered and on your person at all times. So shifting that person towards safety, think about a locked gun poses a much lower risk than an unlocked gun. Unloaded guns, again, much safer. Hiding guns is not usually effective. I was that kid who knew what I was getting for Christmas every year because I knew where my parents hid all of the presents. Kids are snoops, they're gonna go looking. Those who have familiarity with how to operate a firearm, they might be at greater risk because they know how to operate that firearm. And then add emotional distress to your reasons for safety. I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about kids. I'm concerned about people coming into your house and having access to an unsecured firearm and stealing it.
And Katie,
and
we're
then
down
just
to
quick,
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So, and then also we don't want to neglect thinking about those other methods for suicide. Remove excess quantities of medications from your home. If you receive bulk mail medications from your managed healthcare provider, make sure those are locked up and stored away. We want to make sure young people and visitors to our house don't have access to our large quantities. We can buy a lockbox from Walgreens or CVS. There's all kinds of other ways that we can keep our medication safer. Maybe we engage our pharmacist or contact poison control to find out what's a safe level of a medication to keep around in the house. If the person identifies suffocation or hanging as the method by which they would attempt suicide, maybe we can reduce or limit their access to any of those means: shoelaces, blind cords, a trash can lighter. We know that we can't remove access to all lethal means, so we want to keep and maintain that physical and emotional contact with that person, keep eyes on that individual until the situation stabilizes, or until we can get them to help, or until things can get better. Focus on ways of increasing safety. So, and in terms of sharps or bridges, think about remove, limit, or disable. And just always get that person to be thinking about what are ways that what can we do to keep you safer? So in summary, remember those warning signs for suicide, engage with, concern and empathy, focus on increasing that person's safety, omitting any personal judgments that you might have about gun ownership or access to medications. Remind the person that this is temporary. When things get better, when we get you to help, then you can have your firearms back. Be aware that familiarity with firearms and medications can actually increase rather than decrease risk, and get others involved. Don't try to do this all on your own because it can be a challenge. So we want to utilize what other resources we have. I know we're down to the last millisecond of today. I want to entertain or answer any questions that you might have. I also want to point out some national resources that are available. I want to make my contact information available to you all. I'm going to go ahead and re-upload into the chat box the slides so that you have access to them, as well as the list of resources in Missouri in case you are needing to reach out for help for yourself or for a loved one.
Thank you, Katie, for that excellent presentation.